Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Asim Qureshi. I am the research director of an NGO called Cage. We seek to help those who have been harmed by the policies of the global war on terror. It's my honor and privilege to host this discussion. Thanks to the University of Greenwich, but particularly the Centre for Applied Sociology, who have put this event together and invited us to do this. Now, the reason I'm chairing this, even though I'm not from the centre, is because I think by now people are sick to death of me speaking about this new book called I Refuse to Condemn, Resisting Racism in Times of National Security. So I'm the editor of the book, but I've already done many interviews about it. And Adam Elliott-Cooper, Dr. Adam Elliott-Cooper, is part of the department of the University of Greenwich. We felt it was more important that we hear from him because he's one of the authors of one of the chapters in the book, and he hasn't spoken much about his chapter yet, which is why I asked him if it was possible for me to chair and him to speak about his chapter, because we're really interested in hearing from him. And of course, alongside him is Dr. Fatima Regina, who is also one of the contributors. So just to give a bit of background about them, so you know who you are listening to today. Dr. Fatima Regina is a Legacy in Action Research Fellow at the Stephen Lawrence Research Center at De Montfort University. After completing her MA in Islamic Societies and Cultures at SOAS, she went on to do a PhD after successfully securing a Nahud scholarship with the Center of Islamic Studies, SOAS, University of London. And Dr. Adam Elliott-Cooper, who's from the Applied Sociology Research Group at the University of Greenwich, received his PhD from the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford in 2016. His current research focuses on anti-racism and British policing, both on the British mainland and in British colonies. He sits on the board of the Monitoring Group, an anti-racist organization challenging state racisms and racial violence, who do really amazing work. So you should definitely check them out, as of course, Fatima's center, the Stephen Lawrence Research Center. Please do check out their work, their wider work too. So just to as way of introduction to the book, this really, came about largely because I'd had a number of experiences where I had been in kind of public events or in media interviews where at some point or another, somebody, nearly always a white male, would, middle-aged as well, would ask me whether or not I condemned terrorism or condemned a subject that I was speaking about in terms of their trajectories of violence, as somebody who has spent a lot of time studying those who have been on pathways of political violence. So inevitably, because of my kind of overt faith, I don't hide at all that I'm a Muslim. I kind of carry that quite openly without any issue. But usually, I would be separated from any other panelist that I was speaking alongside, or even in TV interviews, that I would be the only one asked this question, even if there were other panelists in a discussion with me about whether or not I condemned the actions of those I was speaking about. And the only locus that I could find to the question being asked with the perpetrators of that violence was my faith. And so, this has been something that has plagued me for a number of years. And I wondered to myself to what extent this was present in the experience of others as well. So really the book started with me having a number of conversations with various people. I called up people like Adam and Fatima, and I said, hey, have you guys ever experienced anything like this? And what was interesting, of course, was the layers that of experience that came about. It wasn't something that was just one experience. There were so many ways in which this culture or this expectation or this demand that we condemn came through. And I think it's quite important. It's one of the most important things about this book, actually, that this is a group of 18 people who are presenting their lived experiences in relation to this demand to condemn, whether it's in personal spaces where they're meeting with friends or so-called allies, or it's in media interviews, or indeed it's the highest authorities in the land at all levels, at all points. This demand, this expectation is made of people of color in particular. And so, we look at the way in which Black communities have demands made of them in relation to, kind of alleged exceptional violence that's presented from Black communities, in the same way that Muslims are asked to constantly condemn terrorism. And I think what felt particularly egregious to me about this whole thing was one interview in particular in 2015, where I was interviewed by Jon Snow, who, for most people, we regard him, and I still regard him as somebody who's very well thought through in relation to how he conducts his journalism, the way he does his reporting. He seems to, he always presents himself as being very, very balanced. I've liked a lot of his reporting over many years. But when he asked me to condemn the actions of somebody who had been very violent, at somebody whose violence I don't know anything about in terms of having any locus to him, it felt like, in a way, egregious in a way that nothing else had previously done. Like, I expect it coming from right-wing commentators. You kind of know the territory you're in when you're talking to them, but not from Jon Snow. And that left markers not only on my psychology but also my physiology. And so part of this book is to really explore the ways in which we are scarred by these moments, the way we carry them throughout our lives, and ultimately, and this is for me the best part of the book, the ways in which we resist. And I think one of the amazing things that all the contributors do is that they really get to the heart of how in their everyday lives they have found ways to resist this demand, to condemn. And so here we are. Now we have this book and we have this panel that we put together today, and I'm really happy to have Fatima and Adam kind of tell you about their experiences and also tell you more about the chapters in their book. So Adam, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. Right at the start of your chapter, you give us an anecdote. I want you to tell us this anecdote in your own words. Give us a little bit of background to it. What the setting for this was. What you were supposed to kind of speak about, but also what happened, if you don't mind.
Sure. Thanks so much, Asim, for agreeing to chair today. So in this particular circumstance, I was invited onto Sky News to discuss the issues that is generally in relation to my research. So my research is generally about policing, racism in Britain more generally, but specifically also campaigns relating to anti-racism as well. And I was invited to come on to debate the issue of gangs in Britain. And the gangster, a bit like the spectre of the terrorist, is, I guess, racial ideas are implicated in constructing this kind of idea of the gangster in the same way as racial ideas are implicated in this idea of the terrorist. And so so often I allude to the way in which racism kind of informs how the police identify who's a gang member and who isn't, or how people in the media also reproduce the idea of who a gang member is or who a gangster is and who isn't. So I went into the studio to sit down, and the producer was waiting with me in the studio before the presenter arrived. And usually they make a bit of small talk with you. They ask you a little bit about your research and your interests and your expertise and what your position is and the kinds of questions that are likely to be asked and all of those types of things. And it's usually very, very professional. But for some reason, the producer, the kind of opening question the producer asked me was, have you ever been in a gang? To which I replied, no. To which I replied, no. I'm here because I'm an academic and my research is in gangs. But as soon as I got home, and as soon as I told my mum was just like, you should have said no. Have you ever been in a gang? Which might have been slightly more amusing. To which, of course, she backtracks and got very flustered and blah blah blah. And although that's a slightly amusing anecdote of a potentially well-meaning but white producer putting their foot in it a little bit, I think it's kind of emblematic of a wider issue, right? And of course, that wider issue is the fact that we associate gangsters or gang members with Black communities very often. And the word gangster conjures up these ideas of what we might call a racial other, right? So whether it's Albanian gangsters or Black gangsters or all these other kind of gangs that are associated with one ethnic or racial group or another. And so therefore, I guess it's a kind of, I found it as a kind of a useful anecdote or entry point into thinking more broadly about how is it that these kinds of racial ideas inform these types of policing, and what can these kinds of media scenarios tell us about racism more generally?
Thank you. I mean, look, you both actually write your chapters in the very first section of the book, where we're asking the question, well, how did we get here? How did we get to this moment that we're all living as kind of diaspora communities within the UK? Most of us are born and raised here or in the West generally, because we've got people from Australia and America also contributing to the book. But there is a trajectory that it's not separated at all from these moments that we're living in. And I was recently reading a book called A Genealogy of Terrorism by Joseph McCade. It's a fantastic piece of research where he looks at the term thuggy as it was used in colonial India and how that morphed into thug. But ultimately the purpose of the word was to look at seditious acts that might lead to political violence. So the word terrorism, as it's used in a colonial context, really starts from the word thuggy and this idea that we need to, kind of particularize a certain type of banditry or violence that's coming from brown people, and how that then transports itself to the UK. And I guess your chapter focuses so much on the kind of commonalities and the similarities that start from this colonial experience. So could you tell us a little bit more about that? And then, I think that would be a good place to bring Fatima into afterwards.
Sure. Of course, there's a very long colonial history of the way in which empire found it very useful to associate the people it was colonizing with violence. We could think about kind of psychosocial reasons. People like Frans Fanon talk about projection. When you're imposing violence upon people, you frame them as being violent. But of course, it served a very effective policy as well, because if you frame people as being essentially violent, then that justifies the kind of control and forms of discipline that you impose upon them, whether it be forms of control and discipline that we associate with the transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery, or through forms of indentured labor, or other forms of settler colonial violence and ethnic cleansing. All of these different forms of violence were, to one extent or another, made possible and justified and furthered through the idea that these people are the violent people. These people are essentially violent. But the use of ideas of terrorists and gangs comes together in a really interesting way in a number of colonial contexts towards the end of empire, particularly in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The idea of communist terror gangs, or simply terror gangs, becomes a very popular part of British discourse in colonies such as Malaya, Kenya, Trinidad, Guyana, a number of different places. And so the idea that groups of colonial subjects who are effectively resisting British rule should be identified as a gang, and the idea that colonial subjects who are resisting British rule through violence are therefore terrorists, becomes a very, very effective tool of propaganda. So you see posters about terror gangs in Malaya and Kenya, all over Britain in the 1950s. You see these kinds of posters being used in these colonial contexts themselves in order to try to win over the colonized population to not join these anti-colonial insurgencies. But you also see it as used as a really important tool for Britain to maintain its reputation as an honourable and respectful and law-abiding nation, which has only used these forms of extreme violence against its colonial subjects because it's faced with terrorism, because it's faced with gangs, because it's faced with the threat of communism. And so we see again the ways in which these kinds of terms are used in ways which are, on the one hand, of course, very racialized, but also affect people's lives in very material ways, and ways in which they enable the justification of colonial violence.
Thank you. That's perfect. Perfectly said. Fatima, we have been taught myths. You know, like what Adam describes. Like it really connects us to that past. But what your chapter initially focuses on is really the way in which that past has been systemically eviscerated, so that we ourselves, as people are born and raised in the UK, we swallow these mythologies around who we are. Can you tell us about the impact that has on us? How is that done, and what impact does that leave on us?
First of all, thank you to University of Greenwich and Adam for inviting me to talk about my chapter. I think one of the things I think that's quite important, and it just happened on Monday. So I'm a part of this project right now in Tower Hamlets with Tower Hamlets Library and Archive and the National Portrait Gallery, and I'm on the steering committee. And they led 4 workshops. So they're planning a set of events and a sort of very, very ambitious program for next year for Tower Hamlets to sort of celebrate the independence, the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh's independence. So what they've been doing up until now is sort of setting up lots of workshops. And for those workshops, they a lot of the young people participating and also the elderly, middle-aged, I mean, most people who are participating are from Tower Hamlets, residents of Tower Hamlets. The vast majority have been Bengalis who've been involved in these workshops. And when we had our meeting on Monday, one of the archivists was telling us how one of the key themes that kept coming out of their workshops was the sense of shame from young people, as well as sort of the older participants in these workshops, this sense of shame of how have I lived in this country all these years and never known that this literally happened on Brick Lane, or this happened, in Whitechapel, this happened, other events took place and other people came and helped us and other people came and organized with us. So, so as much as in my chapter, I specifically sort of reference 1978 and the 4th of May, what happened to Al-Tabali, I think, these things, these conversations are happening every day in different spheres. My sister is an A-level and GCSE history teacher, and she finds this sort of come up within her lessons every day of sort of young people just being a bit shocked when they find out that something or another involved the Caribbean community or the African community or whichever other community. So I think this erasure makes young people discover a lot of these things within outside of the national curriculum context. And I think this is why it's really important watching Small Acts on BBC, where I believe his last episode was looking at the supplementary schools that had to be set up by a lot of African Caribbean communities because of the fact that the mainstream education national curriculum just simply wasn't providing those histories. And I do think it's a shame that they no longer exist. I mean, these supplementary schools also existed in places like East London that I cover in my chapter, where a lot of young people got, they learned their Arabic, they learned their Bengali, they were also given additional history lessons in those classes. So I think what it does is it really makes young people in particular, as a former secondary school teacher myself, where I feel a lot of young people just feel very disillusioned with their everyday presence of, why am I here? Why did my parents come here? Because they're not able to connect those dots. And I think that's what's quite saddening and upsetting when I speak to young people, that a lot of them are totally unaware because the curriculum doesn't cater to those needs. But also, I also want to emphasize that I don't think we need to also rely this much on the national curriculum set by different governments. I think it's also important that communities themselves organize and mobilize and recognize the power of being able to have those spaces to speak to our young people directly and tell them about these events. And I think, this project I'm a part of with Tower Hamlets Library and Archive, it's tremendous, because they're bringing in young people who in their secondary schools in Tower Hamlets are not learning about this, but they're learning it through the local archives, the local library. And again, the sort of power of the local library. And of course, as we know, a lot of libraries around the country are closing. So I think, you know, there are different spaces we can tap into for those things.
Thank you. You mentioned Al-Tab Ali as being quite a seminal moment. You know, for those who don't know that history, why did you choose to focus on that case in particular so much within your essay?
I think I mean, I only started learning about sort of a lot of the sort of histories of African, Caribbean, Asian communities when I actually started at SOAS. Prior to that, I was very much completely unaware of the different movements, the Asian youth movements, the British Black Panther Party, the different collectives that you know, came together, Race Today. I was completely unaware of a lot of those things. And I think learning about it with on a specific module I did at SOAS, and of course because I started my PhD on East London, and I started sort of discovering a lot more about Al-Tabali, and I realized even within the archives, when I started accessing minutes from meetings, when I accessed, you know, and interviewed people from that period, is that I think that was simply the line, like that was just the final sort of straw for everyone. And it just sort of eventually agitated the community, because up until then, a lot of people were experiencing, you know, what is known as Paki bashing, where a lot of people were having bricks thrown through the windows. I had people who spoke about, you know, carrying their hockey sticks with them, their cricket bats with them. I mean, people in my own family experienced Paki bashing in Luton around that time. So I think just reading about it, and just how that was a final straw for the community, and how they just then mobilized people. I mean, we're talking about you know, people filled up coaches from Newcastle, people came from Birmingham, from Leicester, from Southall, you know, different communities. So Darkazha, Barbara Bees from the Black British Panther Party organized people. They came, they did the most famous march down Brick Lane with people like Marla Sen, Farouk Dondi. So I think it's important to recognize these coalition of people who came together, and recognize that this is a moment that that really led the community to erupt, and make sure they were taken seriously. And I think one of the other reasons also that I found it quite profound was historically, when we look at how different communities are racialized, which Adam sort of addressed with regards to sort of thuggery, and who the police racializes as being in a gang or not, South Asians have historically been seen as a community that are more timid. They're a lot more, they're more manageable. They're less quote unquote violent. And I think that moment really just ruptured and came to disrupt those stereotypes. And I think that's when the local government for sure took the community seriously after that. But I also do want to say that a lot of those people who were involved in these movements were eventually also co-opted into the local states, and have become very problematic figures. So I don't want to over romanticize these individuals who are part of these movements either.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's quite important. And I know Remy Joseph Salisbury, you know, speaks about some of these kind of early activists in his chapter a little bit, and how they might have become problematic later on. And I think that's definitely something that we need to do a different treatment on, and in more detailed one later. Adam, you give us a quote in your chapter where you say it is. You cite this quote: "It is deplorable, it is tribal, and it is from America. It follows ragtime, blues, Dixie, jazz, hot cha-cha, and the boogie woogie, which surely originated in the jungle. We sometimes wonder whether this is the Negro's revenge." All right, so this is the Daily Mail writing about rock and roll. And, you know, Fatima and yourself, you've spoken about racialization, you've spoken about how these pathologies are found in our bodies, our cultures, our beliefs, that are then used in order to criminalize us, right? Can you give us some context for your use of this quote, especially in relation to, you know, one of the central motifs of your chapter, which is drill music?
Sure. So culture has always been a really powerful tool in the reproduction of what we might call racial governance. So the ways in which state power uses racism to control people, to impose violence upon them, and to exploit them economically and in other ways as well. And one of the ways in which culture is a really powerful tool is through the idea that certain cultural formations are inherently violent, or non-respectable, or deviant, or incompatible with quote unquote Western culture or British culture or some other forms of national culture. And so whilst we might be familiar with how or a common example might be the way in which Islam is presented as being incompatible with quote unquote Western culture or British culture, whatever that might be. We also see those kinds of patterns with different Black cultural formations as well. This is quite an old British tradition. It goes back further than the British mainland and before the Windrush generation. We can actually date it back or one of the examples that I think is quite interesting is in the late 1800s in British colonial Trinidad. In the Caribbean, where the British colonial administration in the 1800s bans all drumming, all dancing, the playing of all musical instruments, all singing. And anyone who's found to be allowing somebody to do any of those things on their property, I think after the second or third time it's done, can be given a custodial sentence and hard labour. So it's something that's really considered to be extremely important. And we can see the ways in which this is reproduced, not simply in Britain's colonies in the Caribbean after emancipation, but also, of course, here on the British mainland. So we see this through the criminalisation of carnival, whether it be Notting Hill Carnival or carnivals in other multicultural cities across Britain. And the idea that we should associate carnival with violence, with the consumption and the distribution of criminalised drugs and other forms of deviance and mischief and criminality. We also might associate it with reggae music and blues dances, which of course is brought to life in this episode 2 of the Small Axe series on BBC, which Fatima referred to. And we can also see it more recently with the criminalisation of garage music and garage raves through a lot of Black communities not being able to have their music played on mainstream radio, so therefore setting up pirate radio stations which aren't registered, and therefore leading to those people being criminalized. Or with grime music, which is a subgenre of hip hop and sound system cultural formations, which the police produced a 696 for, which asked music venues to catalogue the projected ethnicity of the people who are likely to attend those venues in order for the police to do an assessment as to whether there was likely to be violence or criminality at this particular function. And then we can see it more recently with drill music. And so there's a long history of the policing of culture being used to not only frame colonized subjects or racialized outsiders as being deviant or criminal or violent, but also having a very material effect, a very real effect. And the controlling of these cultural formations effectively is a way of criminalizing people's way of life, right? People's culture, people's forms of expression, the ways in which people communicate and interact with each other. Criminalizing those things means that it's very, very difficult for people to live a fulfilled existence. And so I want to try to get to grips with those kinds of issues a little bit.
So how do we understand the difference between, say, for example, the hyper-violence that we might encounter in certain forms of hip hop, in grime, in drill music in particular? There's a new book called Rap on Trial that really focuses on the ways in which rap is criminalized in America. It's used as part of trials in order to get longer sentences and harsher sentences for predominantly young Black men. We'd say, for example, other forms of hyper-violent culture, like any Hollywood movie, like The Avengers or opera, as an example that you give yourself of being something that is extremely hyper-violent and yet isn't considered to have the same pathology in the same way.
So this is where it becomes very difficult to have these kinds of nuanced conversations on a short kind of media segment on the Sky News, and it's really useful to kind of think through these kinds of problems more carefully in a book like this. And I think one of the issues, of course, is that Okay, so there's probably two or three issues. I think the first is that, of course, art reflects life very often. And if we live in a violent society, whether it be the violence of NATO or the violence of our border regime, or the violence that exists within the household through gender-based violence, or the violence that exists within our streets, particularly in lower income communities, we should be unsurprised, therefore, that people reflect that violence in art, whether it be through theatre or film or music or what have you, or poetry, all of these different things. And so very often it's considered completely normal to see that kind of violence reflected in film, for instance, right? So we know that NATO and the United States are very, very violent, and so we'll watch lots of films like Black Hawk Down where we can see that kind of violence, and that's absolutely fine because it's a piece of art reflecting the violence that exists in the real world. And we might see other types of violence portrayed in, as you mentioned, opera, but in Shakespeare and other forms of theatre as well. And of course, we should see that represented because life isn't a peaceful existence, and so we should be unsurprised that people recount those experiences of violence within art forms. When it's considered problematic or deviant or potentially even criminal is when the wrong type of people begin to reflect the violence of the world within artistic formations. And so you can see this very clearly, I think, in hip hop music, and drill is a subgenre of hip hop which began in Chicago but it's become very popular, particularly in South London, but other parts of the UK as well, which also reflects the very real experiences of violence and harm that many of our young people experience. And so if young people grow up in a low income community, in a working class area where there are very few jobs and people often rely on drug distribution or other forms of criminalized employment, this often can lead to escalations of violence. And recounting those kinds of experiences or recounting what they've seen in their lives is what we see, unsurprisingly, in the music and the other art forms that they create. The problem, of course, is that the police therefore interprets that recounting of violence, that storytelling, those kinds of experiences as carrying out those acts of violence itself. And it's the way in which that kind of sleight of hand emerges. Through institutions like the police, but also the media and the government as well, that we see racism doing that work, racism being able to enable people to make that leap of faith from seeing someone as simply reflecting the violence that exists in many different ways across our society, to say, well, if that person is talking about violence, they are violent. And if people are talking about crime, they are criminals. And if people are talking about deviance, they are the deviants.
Thank you. That's just so perfectly put. I just want to take a moment here to say we have a Q&A function that you'll be able to see at the bottom of your screens. I'm probably going to ask about 20 more minutes more of questions to the panelists, and then I want to open it up to you all to ask deeper questions of both Fatima and Adam. So please do use that function. Start putting putting questions forward, and then I'll hopefully get to as many of them as I possibly can alongside our two guests. Fatima, Adam spoke just now about the way in which certain types of cultural presentations are criminalized or seen as deviant. But even the space, for example, of critique, we have a certain form of criminalization taking place, that if you as a person of color, as a Muslim, step outside of the boundaries of goodness as the state determines it to be, then your critique is seen as not only subversive but potentially seen as some kind of traitorous act or an act of betrayal. And I think nothing really speaks to that as much as the critiques from people like you and me and others of the way in which the government's dealt with Shamima Begum, which you talk about in your essay, right? So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about why presenting an alternative narrative of Shamima Begum's life is considered so subversive and so treacherous by the government.
I feel like, firstly, what sort of how Adam ended response to the previous question, that because she's seen as participating in deviancy, therefore she is deviant. That's how sort of the media constructed this image of her. And I remember after, you know, in 2015, I remember it happened in February 2015 when this whole saga kicked off about the Bethnal Green Academy girls. And it was just, I was just really quite taken aback by the sort of conversations that were happening about 15-year-olds, you know, and maybe because also, you know, I've been a secondary school teacher, I've taught year 10s and year 11s, and I know what it's like to have 15-year-olds, you know, uh, behave and say things. And I think when I started seeing that sort of, because there are two specific articles I remember. One by Grace Dent. She wrote a piece about the Tesco on Bethnal Green Road, and she spoke about how, you know, how she feels, you know, out of place because she's a white woman, because the area is dominated by essentially Muslims. I mean, she codes it in her own way. And then people like Alison Pearson, both of them actually eventually blocked me on Twitter for this, because I literally was borderline harassing both of them for the nonsense they were putting out. Alison Pearson wrote a piece, I remember, talking about how Muslim women like Shamima Begum were joining ISIS because of sexual repression. That was one of the arguments that Alison Pearson put forward. And I think a lot of the people I was speaking to
Because you
around
can't
me,
get sex in living in the UK society, right?
I mean, honestly, some of the stuff that was coming out around that time, I was just so baffled. Like, you know, how do we even critique this? Because it's such nonsense that was coming out from the media. And I think what started concerning me was I know people who, for example, know Shamima Begum's family in Tower Hamlets, in Bethnal Green, people whose, you know, daughters went and sons went to school with them, who went to, you know, masjid with them. So I think for a lot of those families, they then became concerned about their children, and then they then ended up pathologizing Shamima Begum's family and Shamima Begum herself. So they weren't getting a lot of support from within the community, because so many started fearing that, you know, what if, you know, this happens to us, and look at how the media is treating them. But I think it was more the fact that Shamima Begum was just completely, she was treated as a sort of an adult in the media, right? And completely sort of negating the fact that this is a 15-year-old young girl who, you know, has been indoctrinated into believing that this is what she needs to participate in, this is what she needs to do, and go out there and find a way. So I think it's the way she was being presented as a sort of a grown adult woman who is completely aware of her decisions and completely aware of what she was doing. I think that was another element of how the media was sort of hounding her and her family, and sort of questioning her dad, because I saw this interview where they found that her dad lives in Bangladesh. So they did, I think it was BBC or Channel 4, went to Bangladesh, interviewed the father. And it was just so unsettling, the pathologization of the family of Shamima Begum, that somehow, you know, every young Muslim woman, you know, and young Muslim man is sort of inherently on a sort of we're in some sort of like there's like a time bomb within us that's ticking, where the next one is going to, you know, do the same thing. So this sort of again attaching violence to the Muslim body and using Shamima Begum as that sort of key example to sort of say, look, this is, you know, this is something capable by any of them within who live amongst us. And I think it's yeah, so basically turning her into an adult, and the way the pathologization of her and Khadija, and I forgot the other young woman's name who was with her. And then also, you know, what happened to the school. So I don't really I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but the last school where I taught was Bethnal Green Academy. So I knew the deputy head teacher when all of this was happening at the time, and I contacted him, and he was telling me how reporters were hiding in the bushes in Bethnal Green Academy. So Bethnal Green Academy has two entrances. They have one back entrance just near one of the estates, and one front entrance. Just parallel to Columbia, you know, the flower market. And he said, you know, all the teachers had to come in early, a lot earlier than when long before even registration began, just so they could monitor all these journalists who are hiding, you know, behind bushes, behind the gates, you know, randomly shoving microphones in front of like young, you know, kids in uniform. So I think, you know, this. You know, getting all those details from the school, from you know, the teacher that I knew there, and speaking to families who knew the family, and speaking to people that I know in Tower Hamlets, I think the shock it left in people and the way that family was treated, and then how it impacted a lot of other families. And yeah, I just found it quite just disturbing. But it didn't come as a surprise. But even then, when we're not surprised, there is still that element of surprise of thinking, my God, like how low can you really go in trying to sort of speak about this young 15-year-old? And of course, when she was rediscovered in the camp, and then the conversations around her being, you know, pregnant, and about her child, and there was sort of really horrid stuff about, about, you know, the way she dresses, the way she looks, and so, you know, so it wasn't just about her being a Muslim. It was also, you know, the misogyny, the sexism that came with it all as well, and the way she was branded, and how that was completely acceptable. I found quite disturbing, really. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And Adam, the what I think what Fatima says really fits in quite neatly in terms of the way in which there was this construction of Shuma Begum within your within the thesis that you present within your essay, which is around what you call the four stages of moral panic. In particular, focusing on this idea of public safety, racism, how society kind of internalizes these moments and then responds to them in ways that are like societal, but really it's just about making everybody even more racist than they already are. So could you tell us a little bit more about these four stages of moral panic that you posit in your essay?
Sure. So for people not familiar with the moral panic, it's a term popularized by Stuart Hall and his colleagues in the 1970s. And what they say is that capitalism is constantly going through crises, economic crises, social crises, so that people are losing their jobs or their pensions, or they can't get a secure house, or access higher education, and all of these types of things because of the crises of capitalism. And governments isn't really in a position, whether they're willing or able, to deal with these crises. They're not able to reform or overthrow capitalism so that everyone can get gainful employment. They're not able to even reform capitalism enough to make sure that there's enough council housing for everyone who needs it, or secure pensions, or free education, all of these types of things. And so what they do instead is they not necessarily always create, but they certainly exploit a different kind of crisis, a crisis of national security, a crisis of national identity. And it's this crisis that they instead seek to solve. So rather than, as Stuart Hall and his colleagues write in the 1970s, rather than the questions of unemployment and housing and pensions and schooling being the crisis that the government are being faced. Instead, Britain is facing a crisis of criminality. Instead, Britain is facing a crisis of national identity. And that crisis of criminality and national identity arises because of Black immigration, because of so-called coloured immigration from the coloured Commonwealth, from Africa, from Asia, from the Caribbean. And so it's through not simply diverting people's attention from one crisis to another, but in fact displacing one crisis with another crisis, that the power of the moral panic arises. But of course, this was a very effective tool in the 1970s, and you see it being used with great effect by both the Labour government in the 1970s and the Conservative government in the 1980s. But it's also a really useful framework, I think, of thinking about what we might call racial folk devils today. So, idea people like the terrorist or the gangster or the immigrant. And so I use this kind of theory to think about drill music as being a moral panic. So drill music arises as this signifier of Britain's moral decline. As this thing that represents everything that's wrong with Britain, the moral degeneracy of our youth, the violence that exists unabated on our streets, the wanton criminality, which is where so-called criminals are so brazen with their criminality, they boast about it on social media, and the police still can't do anything about it. To identify the fact that really the crisis that Britain is facing is a crisis of austerity. Right? It's a crisis in our housing system. It's a crisis where people aren't able to access mental health provision and all these types of things. But instead, we see Britain arguing that the real crisis that we face is this crisis of national security. Right? It's the crisis of terrorism. It's the crisis of the aliens at our borders. And it's even the crisis that exists within our own towns and cities, right? Represented by the gangsters and their drill music. And so I think about the ways in which the media plays a really interesting and a very integral role in the reproduction of this moral panic in this particular chapter, the 4 stages of the moral panic. And without going into a huge amount of detail about what all the 4 stages are, I think what I instead do is think about the ways in which, or try to illustrate the ways in which the media portray drill or other Black cultural formations as being something unique, uniquely dangerous, uniquely violent, uniquely deviant, and therefore needing a different kind of policing. But also, of course, the way in which it's they lament it as being a signifier of Britain's national decline in the world, and how Britain apparently used to be this lovely place of peace and tranquility, and then suddenly these Black cultural formations came out of arose out of liberal multiculturalism and started destroying the sanctity of family and nation and civility.
Can I just add something to, not add something, but just follow up with?
Yeah.
You mentioned David Starkey talks about whites who have become Black in your essay, right? And it just immediately I remembered you writing about that in the essay as you're speaking. Like, there is this kind of, I guess, malignancy to our cultures and beliefs that is, I mean, you see it with the discourse around Muslims in prison as well, right? That somehow, because of, like, I don't know, some Islamic ability or hegemony within prison, that everyone wants to become a Muslim in prison, and they attach this malignancy to that, rather than obviously concentrating on the way that people change their lives for the better when they do start practicing Islam, when they do convert to Islam. It's all about, well, are they now dangerous, right? So in the same way, like, Starkey's kind of attaching this kind of viral element to this, almost like, oh, well, everybody might catch this if we allow it to carry on. So sorry if you would something about that.
I think it's a really important. No, I think it's a really important point. One of the things that is considered problematic is that people might convert to Islam in prison, or people might start making rap music in prison, right? Whereas these are, like, if you're locked into a cage, how do you survive, right? You survive. People survive through spirituality and through art and through culture, right? We should be unsurprised that these are survival mechanisms for people, coping mechanisms for people, for ways in which people, I guess, see a different, survive in those kinds of circumstances. So we should be unsurprised that people find faith and culture and art in prison. But of course, it has to be the right type of culture, it has to be the right type of art, and of course, it has to be the right type of religion. And of course, you see with David Starkey in his very famous conceptual pivots that he does it after the riots of 2011, in which he asserts that, of course, there are white people who have been rioting across this country. But that isn't because this country has a history of rioting, which of course it does, as a historian like David Starkey should know all too well. But instead, rather, Britain doesn't have a historical culture of rioting. It is rather that the whites have become Black, and Black people have brought rioting from wherever it is that they come from to Britain, and then infected white people with their culture of rioting, which is why rioting exists in Britain in 2011. And so we see the ways in which racism isn't simply about how much melanin is in your skin, but the extent to which you've been infected through a culture of a racialized outsider in one way or another as well. People becoming almost racialized by proxy.
Thank you. That was so perfect. And all of this has a daily impact on us, right? Like we feel this establishment of like a two-tier system in our lives in manifold ways. And Fatima, you write of some personal experience that you've had where you on Mother's Day you went to a restaurant with a friend, and I want you to tell us a bit about that, because I think that story is so indicative of the ways in which we are otherized by virtue of the color of our skin. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind just sharing that, please.
I always laugh when I think back to that incident, because of just, I think I've only been really fully angry in my life a handful of times, and that's just one of those moments. Me and my friend, we were just really hungry because we just wanted to get some food. That was all we wanted to do that day. Yeah, I remember that moment so vividly. Where I stood, who looked me in the eye, and who rejected us, and then the conversation, how we crossed the road. Yeah. So just to give a bit of context, a friend and I, we were hoping to just grab brunch in Welwyn Garden City, and we walked into one cafe first, and they were booked because of Mother's Day. We thought, cool, that's fine. So we thought, they said, look, check out Cult, maybe they have tables available. Went there, and I kid you not, the whole restaurant was empty. I remember it being empty. There were no reserve signs on any of the tables, and they just basically looked us up and down. um, and my friend was wearing a hoodie with tracksuit bottoms on, because we were questioned about actually what we were wearing afterward, which is really quite, interesting, because of the way they were trying to, I guess, locate us racially and how we looked in that moment. And then they rejected us, but it was more the process of how they looked at us, how they spoke to us, how they looked us up and down. We walked out, and then my friend just said, did you just feel what I
Or
think
they said
they
to you
did?
that they have no space available for you,
Yeah,
just to
they
clarify.
said we have no space available. So when we were walking back to the car, he just said, you know what, I feel like they basically, am I looking into this? And he just started getting paranoid, which is what you do, right? Where you start questioning, did we just experience what we experienced? And then I just looked at him, I said, well, basically how they just treated us is basically, without using the word, they basically told us we don't want to really have Pakis in our restaurant, because the few customers who were there were all white. And anyone who knows Welwyn Garden City will know that, it's a majority white town. So he thought, he was like, you know what, I'm gonna give them a call, put on my poshest accent, sound like I'm an Englishman, and I'm gonna see if I can reserve a table. He rang them, and he sounded like he could have been like, a part of the royal family. And then within 10 minutes, they said, look, come back, we'll have a seat ready for you, table ready for you within 10 minutes. And we sat in the car, and we were trying to figure out, what do we do? But both of us were so angry. I think we just sat in the car for like 10-15 minutes just to calm ourselves down, because of the rage we were feeling in that moment of, wow, this is what just happened. And I just thought, you know what, again, my rage definitely dictated this, but I just thought, you know what, I'm not going to let you get away with this. I'm not gonna have someone basically call me a Paki, and without calling me one, and then think they can get away with it. So I put it out on Twitter, and then it somehow went viral, and then we were invited to Victoria, Derbyshire. The CEO of Coke came on, and he was just unbelievably patronizing behind the scenes, behind the cameras. So, and he said, we would have offered you a seat, that's all, we did offer you, why did you have to make such a big fuss? um but I will never forget, like you said, Asim, when you had your encounter with Jon Snow and how it's physiologically sort of changed you, I will never forget how what it did to me, of knowing that, that's what happened, and the impact it had on me for the few weeks after that. Actually, I was distraught, because of the impact it had on me, it had on my friend. So yeah, I really wouldn't wish anything like that on anyone. But yeah, so that's what happened that day. And Yeah, you know, when you type in my name, that's the only thing that comes up. So, you know, whenever I get employed, that's the first thing what my employers mentioned to me. You took on co. I said, well, look, I had to. So yeah, it's funny now, you know, when I look back, but in that moment, it was just, it was horrible. It was really nasty, the experience and the trolling we experienced as well. And in the trolling, people were being racist to us, and I just thought, well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, and I wanted to kind of end our section of discussion really with that kind of personal experience. You know, we can theorize about this as much as, you know, it is possible, really. But ultimately, we have, and what this book tries to do, it tries to remind us all that this has an impact. It leaves scars. It has an impact on the body and the mind. And that's why racism has to be taken seriously, because it's not something that we can simply limit to an abstract discussion. You know, that's not really, you know, and our function as scholar activists is really to highlight the violence in ways that other people can recognize. And you know, one of the amazing things, I guess, about this book so far, in a lot of the reviews that have been written, a lot of the comments people have been leaving on social media and writing to us about, is really how much they feel seen in terms of their own experiences. They're reading your experiences that you've had, and how much confidence it's giving them to feel like they're not alone, that they have others who are in this struggle with them. So again, thank you to both of you for sharing so much of yourselves within these essays. Um, so right now we don't have any questions that have been asked, maybe because you guys were so, you know, utterly clear in everything that you were saying, that, you know, it's left, and, you know, really with any doubt about, you know, the strength of your arguments. Definitely hope that that is the case. um so let me carry on then, while maybe we wait for one or two people to ask some questions. So to both of you, and you can take it in turns, maybe Adam first. Why must we refuse to condemn? You know, why is this important as an act?
I think it's important as an act, because it's a really good question, actually. Um, I think it's important because one of the things I think that question seeks to do is to create a binary, right? There are goodies over here, there are baddies over here, there are heroes over here, and there are villains over there. And inevitably, in these kinds of contexts where we're talking about the topic of the book, which is national security, um, uh, Muslims or black people or racialized others are the villains, and the police, the border regime, the state are the heroes. And I think we have to obviously problematize that binary in many ways. And it's possible for individuals to do harmful things and harm people and act in ways that are violent towards others, and for us to be critical of that. But also, of course, we have to be critical of the state and forms of state violence, and the social and economic and political context in which individual people might end up harming other people. And in order for us to do that, we can't simply uh, you provide a kind of one sentence condemnation. We have to think about this. We have to think about this harm or violence that may have been carried out in that wider context. And so I think that in trying to be more nuanced in that, we can think about the kind of complexities of these kinds of issues. And I think going back to Shamima Begum is a really useful way of doing that, because I think maybe an even more tired trope than do you condemn? The most tired of all the tired tropes, surely, is where are you really from? That is the most tired of, like, everyone's kind of sick of hearing it. But I think the Shamima Begum case, I think, really gets to the root of that question. Because what happened to Shamima Begum? Like a number of other people in this country, she had her citizenship stripped. And why could she have her passport taken away? Not because she is anyway, let's not even get into that. But why is it that she's able to have her citizenship stripped? Why is it that Britain that Theresa May can say that citizenship is a privilege, not a right, for somebody who was born in this country, has only ever known this country, and has always lived in this country. The reason for that is because Britain knows, even at the states level, at the very top of government, that one day Shamima Begum can go back to where she's really from. And we can strip her of her citizenship. We can exile her from this country as a child, because she can just go back to where she's really from. And so I think that whilst this is a tired and often banal and irritating question, I think it speaks to a wider question of state power and the relationship between nationalism and race, and the ways in which the states can take this seemingly banal question to its logical end through exile and sending someone back to somewhere where they're really from, even if they've never lived there before, because of the ways in which race and nation come together. And we're not able to have conversations that critique that if we're constantly being asked the question, but do you condemn? Because if you condemn, therefore, it justifies the kinds of penal punishments of imprisonment and exile and other forms of violence, which I think are the types of state power that we're trying to problematize as well.
Perfect, thank you. Fatima?
One of the things I think is quite important to also remember, this sort of expectation of, I've just written down some notes, expectation of condemnation from Muslims in particular, is also because it's a conduit to achieve other things, which is to silent dissent, right? So Muslims don't speak out, aren't vocal about the issues impacting them, whether it's, the prevent strategy, whether it's, vocalizing the support for Palestine, whether it's coming out and, condemning, not condemning, sorry, coming out and condemning other state legislations or foreign policy. So I think it's also there as a way, not just to sort of remind you of your place within the sort of racial taxonomy, but also to remind you of sort of, your as sort of Adam briefly touched on it, this sort of temporariness of your existence within this sort of little island mentality, right? So with Shamima Begum, what's really interesting, because the last project I worked on at UCL and Surrey for and I published my latest co-authored piece with Dr. Victoria Redcliffe, where we interviewed Bangladeshis in Luton, London and LA and Birmingham. And what we found in those interviews, particularly the British Bangladeshis were interviewed in Luton, London and Birmingham, was that so when Shamima left to join ISIS, we conducted the interviews in 2016 in Luton and Birmingham. So most of our participants from Luton and Birmingham started sharing how since that incident, because that's when they all suddenly came to the realization of how sort of, lax the existence is within this sort of state legislation around citizenship, that a lot of them have actually started reinvesting in their properties back home, and they're actually re-establishing links with Bangladesh because of this sort of this annoying question of where are you really from, even though these Bengalis themselves have accepted that actually, okay, our heritage is from there, but we're settled here now. But I interviewed third, fourth generation young people in their 20s who could barely speak a word of Bengali, when their parents were speaking in the middle of these interviews, and I conducted all the interviews. They were admitting that, look, we're trying to figure out, laws in Bangladesh of like taking ownership of the property and making sure we have a housekeeper who looks after our property, and maybe renting it out or maybe converting it into a hotel and keeping a space for my family should we need to leave, or if we're asked to leave. And that became a common theme because of what happened to Shamima Begum. And but going back to the sort of condemnation, I think it's also important to remember that particularly the Muslim community, right? So when I speak about the Muslim body, I speak about the community itself. That has been the site of exercising power, of again reminding you of your place, exercising that power to let you know that you will always be on the margins, on the periphery of the society, and the sort of stripping of citizenship. And obviously, Asim, you know this very well from your work, that the vast majority of people who have had the citizenship strip have been Muslims. So I think it's important to remember how our bodies are used as the site to exercise that power, to remind you of your place. And one of the things that I absolutely love about Stuart Hall's writings, and his particular quote that stuck with me since my PhD, and that's when I started sort of reading most of his works, was when he says, I am the sugar in white people's cup of tea in Britain, right? And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what, particularly because I researched the Bengali community, I thought, well, Bengalis are the tea bag then. If Stuart Hall is a sugar, Bengalis are the tea bags, because if we look at where the British forcibly put together tea gardens, like for example, the vast majority of Bangladeshis in Britain are from Sylhet. Sylhet is famously known for its tea gardens. That's where a lot of Sylhetis go, with their families when they want to have, an outing. So, I thought about that quote and I thought, oh my God, the tea bags are tea, and that's what we are in that cup of tea, and so I think it's important. That's why I think in order to really gain any kind of sort of self-realization politically here, speaking politically here, and political consciousness, we have to be able to link these sort of historical ties with this nation and how we exist within its sort of bounds, and where we actually don't exist within its bounds. We're so much on the periphery that it's so easy to just push us out of it. So I think um, I've forgotten the original question now, but I hope I've somehow answered your question, Asim.
Absolutely.
Can I just add that the chocolate biscuit that you duck into the tea is West Africa for all the Nigerians and Ghanaians here as well.
Perfect. So we brought everything back down to tea. In a way that's so absolutely fitting. So we've got some questions now, which is really great. We've got Ikram. She's asking, since we refuse to condemn, how do you advise we go about this? And she says, doing so is so exhausting, and as you've already highlighted, it takes such a toll. Therefore, what do you suggest we do to ensure this condemnation continues without being detrimental to us?
I'm happy to go first, if that's okay. So I think there are two things that we need to do rather than simply condemning. The first thing we have to do is to identify and articulate the circumstances in which people might articulate violence through art, such as drill music, or actually harm other people themselves. Right? What is the context? Do people do that because they're just inherently bad people? Or does violence actually exist in places where there's poor housing? There are bad employment opportunities. People aren't able to access education or mental health provision or youth services, or all of these other types of things that people need in order to live a fulfilled livelihood and make them less likely to harm other people and less likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. And so if we argue, therefore, that maybe people would be less likely to recount violence if they hadn't experienced violence themselves, then we can think, okay, so we need to therefore invest in all of these things in order to live in safer communities. I think the other thing we of course need to do, rather than simply condemning, is condemning the violence of the states, which we've talked about a great deal already. In what ways are people's civil liberties being eroded or taken away by preventing them from performing music or any of these types of things that I talk about in my chapter? Why, in what ways has the expansion of our prison system, which has almost doubled in the last 30 or 40 years, led to more and more people being harmed, an expansion of state power? How are the different ways in which more police powers, more powers of our border regimes, leading to more people being harmed through deportation or immigration detention, or the use of tasers or criminal behaviour orders that prevent people from going to certain places and speaking to certain people or using social media, what have you? In what way are all of these forms of state's power eroding people's liberties and lives in different types of ways, and of course reproducing forms of racism? And so I think by thinking about these kind of two quite broad areas, we can hopefully cut through this problematic that seeks us to simply condemn, rather than looking at the wider context in which violence exists within society.
Thank you. Fatima?
I feel like Adam so succinctly provided a response. I feel like I'm going to be repeating a lot of things he said, but yeah, I think that was quite a succinct response to the question.
Sure, no problem. So the next question is, you know, and it's probably a little bit wider. Are you positive about the future with the rise of BLM, more people being aware of these issues, the rise of scholar academics and activists like yourselves, and through the use of social media, like, you know, your voices are amplified? Do you feel positive then about the future?
I mean, you know, there are times I feel I'm intrinsically cynical about life and about everything. But then there are times in my work when I come across stuff in the archives, or I interview someone from a particular generation where they did a lot of this work, grassroots organizing, and recently, sort of watching when I watched Mangrove, the first episode in the series for Small Axe on BBC. It really did instill hope and optimism in me that, there are a lot of people that I've met in the last few years who are incredibly hopeful in the possibility of the possibility of reimagining the sort of our communities, our society in different ways, and our world as well, in trying to connect different issues. So I have moments where I definitely feel very hopeful and positive, and feel like there is a lot, there are a lot of good people out there, a lot of good people who are willing to make change, who are doing the work day in, day out, from you know um, the mutual aid groups that I saw set up, for example, in Luton, and how people came together. Local businesses were giving food and things to a group of women who volunteer to cook the food, so they don't feel like we're just people that we're delivering the food to, we're just being given sort of tinned food. So the care that people were putting in, and the care for the community, and also love for the community, for people. I think seeing that, rather ironically, through this pandemic, I've realized that there really is a possibility to see this world in a different way, to reimagine it. And as Arundhati Roy says, on quiet days you can hear her. You can hear that this world is possible, it is out there. So I have moments of cynicism and feeling very pessimistic about the world, but then I meet incredible human beings who are doing astonishing work, who aren't on social media, who aren't talking about it on sort of in a sort of public platform or arena. So I think those things give me hope, just meeting those people and just seeing, what, there definitely is that possibility of creating a different world for ourselves and our children.
Thank you. Adam, please.
Yeah, I think that although there are lots of things to be cynical about, I think we have a duty to be hopeful for a number of reasons. I think principally because I think the people who came before us, who in many ways were in far more difficult and challenging circumstances, whether it's people who came centuries before us and lived under enslavement or indenture or direct colonial rule, imperial control, they had hope. Right? They imagined a different world, and they worked to bring that different world into fruition. And even people organizing today, whether it be people resisting against the power of police violence in Nigeria, or forms of militarism in occupied Kurdistan, or the resistance of people in Palestine, or the challenges to state power in parts of the Amazon. All of these people have hope, right? And they don't simply articulate that hope, right? They bring that hope with them into their actions. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us to also bring that same kind of hope, not simply in the way in which we think and we imagine the world, but also in our actions and the way in which we interact with each other and the way in which we engage with the people around us as well.
Thank you. That was so wonderful from both of you. There was only just one comment that somebody left for us to maybe finish on, and it's really directed at you, Fatima, from Tracy. She says, hi, Fatima, a comment really. As you were talking about Shamima Begum and the way she was treated by the media, I was also reminded of a concept, adultification, and ways that schools or teachers or police find it difficult to see racialized bodies as children, and all the usual connotations that childhood conveys. And so from a very young age, these state instruments are less protective and more punitive towards Black and racialized bodies. I mean, I think that really captures a lot of what both of you were saying. I don't know if you want to say anything in response to that.
I mean, even right now, when we look at sort of expulsions in school or sort of the pupil referral units, the vast majority of students in those units are made up of young, usually young Black boys. And again, it's because of pretty much everything that Adam's been speaking about, of the way these young Black boys are treated in school and seen in school, and sort of not just racialized, but literally just the way they may speak across the classroom to another pupil is seen as a form of threat, you know. So we're talking about, you know, again, as a former secondary school teacher, you have kids being rowdy all the time, you know. So this isn't an exclusive behavior to a particular pupil because of their background, but really, you know, having been in staff room where sometimes the way teachers spoke about pupils, even if they were never my pupil, I never taught them, I already knew what the background of the pupil because of the way teachers speak about young people that they teach and they find, you know, disruptive in their lessons. So I think it's important to remember, you know, this adultification, you know, as did you say it was Tracy mentioned, is that, you know, this doesn't just apply, you know, with the way young people, particularly racialized young people, are discussed in the media, but in the everyday, and pupil referral units are pretty much made up, I don't know what the stats are, but pretty much made up of mostly young Black boys. So I think it's important to remember that, you know, this is an everyday occurrence, not just something that just happened with Shamima Begum and the representation. That was just on a macro scale, right? So what the PRU units is what's happening on a micro scale to these young racialized people.
And it's probably worth adding, and Asim, you probably know more about this than I do, that this is also the case of the way in which the prevent agenda operates as well. And you see the prevent agenda being used in not just primary schools, but in nurseries, where people are interpreting like the actions and art and words of young children from Muslim families as being somehow affected by some kind of violent ideology. Right? What more of a abhorrent example of this kind of adultification can there be than this? The use of the prevent agenda in these kinds of environments against pre-adolescents. And so we see the ways in which people are being framed as violent, not simply because they have somehow the potential to have the kind of violence of an adult person because they're considered to be a Black boy and therefore hyper masculine and hyper strong and hyper threatening, but also there's some kind of like adult psychology of violence as well, which young children from Muslim families must be able to articulate through their arts, which is why we have to have prevent in nurseries and in infant schools and things like that as well. So we see the ways in which these different forms of racialization and adultification overlap and can't be separated by different kinds of racialized categories. But I think it's very much interconnected when we think about the ways in which they operate across these different spheres.
That was perfectly connected, Adam. Thanks for doing that. We don't have any more questions, so I think this is a good time. You know, we're going for an hour and 20 minutes to bring this session to a close. You know, I think reflecting on the discussion that we've had today, it's so important again for me to reiterate that, you know, what we're talking about is not something that's abstract. You know, we are, as both Fatima and Adam have so perfectly put throughout the last hour and a half, this has real world ramifications for us in so many different ways, and it interconnects with other forms of violence too. It's not the question that is inherent to do you condemn, is the actual question that sits behind it is, can you please prove to us that you are deserving of humanity so that we can grant it to you in a way that we feel is deserving? That is the question that sits behind the question. So whenever you hear the word, do you condemn, then automatically what that should do is tell you a lot about the questioner, about the anxieties that the questioner has. This questioner believes that you are somebody who might potentially commit an act of violence or support an act of violence against them until you have proved otherwise. And in that question is a harm that it's almost impossible for us to calculate, right? So I think that's why these conversations are important, because what my scholar friends are so effectively able to do is to really unpick the layers by which we are implicated in our otherization, in our criminalization, by the kinds of questions that are asked of us, by the knowledge that is produced about us, by the way that we are presented with by politicians and the media and think tanks and whoever else. This is a structure. It's a structure of violence. And so while of course, I recommend our book, I Refuse to Condemn, Resisting Racism in Times of National Security, there are other books as well that are very, very important for us to be thinking about in terms of this. So The Fire Now, that was collated by Remy Joseph Salisbury, sorry, I've forgotten her surname now, and Aziza Johnson, who's one of the authors of I Refuse to Condemn. That's out there. You've got Nadine Al-Neni's book, Bordering Britain. I just finished Luke de Nahonra's book, Deporting Black Britons, which is superb, and really, I think, is another layer that we could add to this conversation. In fact, I'm now gutted that I didn't ask Luke, because I hadn't read his book up until that point, to be a contributor to this collection, because I think he would have done such an excellent job of adding yet another layer to conversations that we're trying to have around this book. So really, I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to be with us today. My many, many, many thanks to the Center for Applied Sociology, and that's effectively what we're doing. We're doing applied sociology with this. We're showing how this stuff is relevant in our everyday lives. And so, I hope you all took something away from today. I hope you will write to Fatima and Adam with any other questions or queries that you have, or even just to express your appreciation for them, as much as I appreciate everything that they do and that they give, not just to the book, but outside of that too. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great remainder of your evening. Good night.
Thanks so much, Asim. All the
Thank
best,
you,
everyone.
everyone. Take care. See you later.